This is Globalization Review, page 1. Alright, so we're going to start back at the Columbian Exchange. When Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492, if you want to throw a date up there. And the Columbian Exchange is to talk about the exchange of goods from one continent to another. So can anybody tell me some things that the Europeans brought to the New World when they arrived here in America? What were some of the things? Raise your hand, please. Kyle? Diseases is the big one. Good. Anybody have something else? Gage? Horses. And other types of livestock. Horses, cows, pigs. What about as far as like crops go? What kind of things were coming? Yeah. Nope, that was a Native American gave to Europeans. Emma? Yeah, the wheat, the barley, the oats. Europeans had very few vegetables and fruits in their diet before the Columbian Exchange. And certainly we know the one that had the most impact there is going to be disease. You might want to jot down 90% of the native population is wiped out after the initial contact, and most of that is from disease. 90%. Okay? And that's just, we had to do estimates because disease traveled faster than people. So there were whole civilizations that were wiped out before we ever encountered them. All right, what are some of the things then that Native Americans introduced to Europeans? Ben? Okay, that's questionable. We actually have scientists who are disagreeing with that now, but yes. Okay, anything else? Eric?
The tomato.
Okay, very good. Tomatoes. Maize or corn.
Smallpox.
No, smallpox was European to Native American.
Oh, other way around.
Yeah. What were the three sisters? Somebody said corn already.
Corn, beans,
And squash, okay? Corn, beans, and squash. So Native Americans introduced lots of fruits and vegetables to the Europeans. Potatoes, okay? Things like that. Right? So there was a very important exchange of goods. You might also want to put on the European to Native American side alcohol, because that's, again, going to have some pretty devastating effects on the native population. Okay. All right. Now, let's move into the colonial era. And we need to define kind of the relationship between the 13 colonies and England. So we're talking here from about 1607 to 1754 with these terms. 1607 with the founding of Jamestown to 1754. All right, so salutary neglect. We already talked about in the timeline review. This is how we would the words we would use to define the relationship. And what does salutary neglect mean? AJ?
In this case, Britain didn't enforce the rules that it set up for the colonies.
Very good. Yeah, Britain didn't have a lot of rules for the colonies to begin with. And if they did make rules, they really didn't enforce them. They pretty much let the colonies just develop on their own, which had the impact of the colonies having greater ethnic diversity, having their own government systems. In some of the colonies, more religious toleration than what you would have had in England. Mercantilism. Another way we would define this relationship between the colonies and England. What is mercantilism? Sarah?
It's like the belief that a country's wealth is measured in how much gold and silver they have.
Okay, very good. A country's wealth is measured in how much gold and silver they have. So why do they want colonies in a mercantilist system? What's the purpose of the colonies? Gage? Very good. The colonies are to supply raw materials to the mother country. What else do the colonies provide for the mother country? Lowen? Market for manufactured goods. Okay? So the colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country. That is their purpose. Okay. Now, Britain did try in the earlier colonial times to enforce the mercantilist system. What is one of the things that they put in place to try to enforce it?
The Navigation Acts.
Very good. The Navigation Acts, which were a series of laws made from 1650 to 1673. 1650 to 1673. Some of the rules said that trade could only be on colonial-built or English-built ships. Anything the colonies imported was supposed to go through Great Britain first. And there were certain goods, like tobacco, that the colonies could only export to England under these rules. So very few of the rules were actually enforced very well. Okay, New England probably was most at fault for breaking the Navigation Acts because they were involved in triangular trade. And they were making rum, and it was going to Africa in exchange for slaves, and the slaves were going to the West Indies in exchange for sugar, and the sugar was coming back up to make more rum. So anybody know what they did, England did set up in New England for a brief time to try to enforce the Navigation Acts and stop the smuggling of goods? Anybody? Dominion of New England for a time, and it didn't last very long. Okay. So other than the Navigation Acts, there were very few rules, there were very few restrictions, and a lot was not enforced. Okay. All right, now that all changes or begins to change in 1754 with the events leading up to the Revolution. So let's start with the French and Indian War. That's 1754 to 1763. Who fought in the French and Indian War? It was mainly between the British and the French. This was not the first war they had fought. They had fought in previous wars with each other. So this is just the last in a long line of wars. Native Americans will fight on both sides. And what were France and Britain fighting about in this particular war? Yeah, the interior of North America, the area we're sitting in here, sitting on today. Okay. Obviously, the colonists fought with the British, but they were kind of treated as like second-class soldiers, not really given officer status and things like that. And who won the war? Britain won the war, so that they pretty much ousted France from North America. And that was the Treaty of Paris of 1763 that ended it. Now, follow the arrow over to Pontiac's Rebellion. Okay. When the war was wrapping up, Chief Pontiac, okay, who lived west of the Appalachian Mountains in the area of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, decided to continue fighting, and he started to attack the British forts in the Northwest Territory. And for a while, he took over just about every British fort. Why is Pontiac's Rebellion significant? Hold on, let me tilt lights down so that it records. Okay, Laurel?
Didn't it lead to the Proclamation of 1763?
Very good. It led to the Proclamation of 1763 because the British were like, oh my gosh, we just got done fighting this war, we're in debt, we don't want to have to protect the colonists from the Native Americans. And so they made the Proclamation of 1763, which basically said you cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. And how did the colonists react to this? How did the colonists react? Yeah, John?
Didn't they think that the British went over because they said they went over on the
Yeah, they basically ignored it, but they were angry about it. And why were they angry? Alex?
They just fought a war for land they were not allowed to colonize.
Very good. Yeah, they fought the war because they wanted that land to settle. And Virginia and Pennsylvania and some of those colonies had already started to claim that for their colony. And now they're not allowed to settle there. Right? And they're also used to salutary neglect. They're used to not being, having a lot of rules made for them. All right, so this war leads directly to the Proclamation of 1763. It also leads to the very first taxes. Not the very first taxes, but more taxes on the colonies. Right? Examples, the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, some of the first examples. Why was Britain taxing the colonies more? Kyle?
Pay for debts from the previous war.
Very good. Yeah, they had to start paying for their debts off, and they felt like the colonists should have to pay for some of their protection. So the Sugar Act was a tax on sugar. The stamp tax was on all kinds of paper products. And why did that tax especially get people all riled up? Tara?
Everything was paper.
Okay, yeah, that it affected everyone. And it was a direct tax as opposed to an indirect tax. A direct tax, the people themselves are paying directly. An indirect tax, the merchant is paying, and they're just it's being translated into a higher cost on the good for the consumer. But the consumer is not always aware that there's a tax there. Okay? So this is, how did the colonists begin to protest things like the Sugar Act and the stamp tax? Kyle?
Boycotts.
Very good. Boycotts or non-importation agreements. Tara?
Then they formed the Stamp Act Congress.
Very good. Yeah, they start to have some intercolonial meetings like the Stamp Act Congress and send petitions to the Parliament and the King. Connor?
Starting the Sons of Liberty and burning effigies of tax collectors.
Very good. Yeah, starting the Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty. Sons of Liberty were a little bit more forceful in their tactics. Okay. Most of those early taxes end up getting repealed. Okay. And then you had the round of the Townsend Acts. And you might want to note there, those were indirect taxes. But they were on everyday things like tea and glass and paper. So at first you don't see the same resistance to the Townsend Acts that you did some of the other taxes. But eventually the colonists pick up on it and you see the non-importation agreements and things like that start. The other thing about the Townsend Acts is it also gave a writ of assistance to the British to search colonial homes. A writ of assistance to the British to search colonial homes for smuggled goods. A writ of assistance, which is a general search warrant. And again, why are the colonists so mad about these taxes?
They're not used to paying them.
They're not used to paying them. And what's their other argument? No taxation without representation. And of course, Parliament came back and said, you have virtual representation. Every member of Parliament represents every British subject. All right, then you had the Tea Act. Again, most of the Townsend Acts were repealed except for a tax on tea. Then you had the Tea Act. That was not a tax on tea. It gave the British East India Tea Company a monopoly on tea in the colonies. It gave the British East India Tea Company, which was a huge company in Britain. It was having financial trouble. It gave them a monopoly on tea in the colonies. It actually lowered the price of tea. But the idea here is that it's like the principle behind it. And that they were trying to use this to cover up that there was still a tax on tea. That, of course, what was the colonial reaction to that? Boston Tea Party. And in response to that, you had the passage of the Intolerable Acts. Anybody remember one of the things that the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts did? Gage?
Shut down Boston Harbor.
Shut down Boston Harbor until they repaid for the damages.
They were no longer allowed to get together meetings.
Very good, yes. The Massachusetts Government Act said you're not allowed, your legislature is not allowed to meet without the permission of the British officials. Connor?
The Quartering Act.
The Quartering Act was expanded. It already existed. It was expanded. And it said Britain officials who commit crimes in the colonies would no longer be tried in the colonies. They'd be tried in Britain. Okay. At the same time, the Quebec Act was passed, if you want to note that on the side. And that's what gave Quebec the territory of the Northwest Territory, which is going to anger. Most of this had been centered, remember, in New England. Most of the anger and the problems. But that's going to bring Virginia and some bigger colonies on board because that impacts them, the Quebec Act did.
Could you repeat that?
Quebec Act gave the territory, the Northwest Territory, to Quebec. Like it annexed it to instead of to these other colonies. The Howardys started to put claims there. So in April of 1775, you have the first battles of the Revolution at Lexington and Concord, and that was the official start of the Revolution. April 1775. So remember, the war started before we ever declared independence. All right, and that's the end of page 1.